Welcome to Sports Tonight Live. Welcome in particular to a very special programme that we want to bring you today. Some footballers are described as living legends. Some footballers, unfortunately, who are legends, are no longer with us. And one of those footballers that falls into that second category is, of course, Duncan Edwards. Duncan Edwards was said to be the greatest English footballer of all time, or could have been. My father watched Duncan Edwards play, and he told me he was the greatest he'd ever seen. Sadly, of course, Duncan Edwards is no longer with us, being a victim of one of the most terrible chapters in the history of football, the Munich Air Disaster of 1958. I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome into the studio today James Leighton, author and writer, who has put together the definitive story of Duncan Edwards. Sadly, we lost him at 21, already an England international, 2 FA Cup final victories, and he'd been in the semi-final of the European Cup. Over the next half hour, we're going to tell you his story. Well, James, thank you very much indeed for joining me in the studio today. First of all, I have to say to you, you don't have any obvious links with Duncan Edwards. He was born in the Midlands. He played for Manchester United. You yourself are from South Wales. So what was your instigation and what was your motivation to write this book?
I think, as I said in the book, Mike, I've grown up in a football family. My father is a football fanatic, and we've always, even though we're Cardiff City supporters, we've always been travelling to games to look at the stars of today. And when we go to these games, we'd always have that age-old conversation, who is the greatest footballer of all time? And my godfather would come along on the trip, and throughout the 1950s, he would travel all around the country. He was a football fanatic. He wanted to watch Stanley Matthews, Billy Wright, and he'd say, well, we were talking about Zidane, Maradona, Ronaldo. He'd say, without a shadow of a doubt, Duncan Edwards is the greatest footballer of all time. And he was quite insistent on that. So as the years went by and YouTube came about, I started to look at a few flickering black and white images of Duncan Edwards playing on YouTube.
As we see here in the studio.
That's right. And I just wanted to get to the bottom of it once and for all, to try and really find out just who this man was and was he as great as so many revered people in the game say he is. OK, and having now researched and written the book, what's your verdict? More so than ever. I was quite sceptical at first about whether he could be called the greatest of all time, because after all, he only played 4 seasons of professional football. But when you weigh up the fact that Duncan Edwards could play, and he did play, in every position for Manchester United, including he played in goal in the Charity Shield, where he kept a clean sheet during his stint in goal. How many players in the English game could play in every single position, right foot, left foot, at the back, up front, and be called world-class in every position? It's what Bobby Charlton says to him in a quote in your book. He could pass short, he could pass long, he could play defensively, he could play attacking, he could head the ball. He was the greatest. That's the pictures you're talking about. That is the iconic picture. Duncan Edwards, young, handsome, strong, fit as a fiddle, virtual teetotaler, man who dedicated himself to football. The loss is just one of the greatest tragedies in sport of all time. I mean, reading your book literally reduced me to tears. It's one of the saddest stories I've ever read. How did you get through it writing it? I think towards the end I was actually getting quite emotional when I was writing about it. When you start hearing about how his mother reacted in the hospital, she had to be sedated. His girlfriend Molly Leach collapsed. His teammates wept when they were told in hospital. Just horrifying to think that this guy, who was just a perfect physical specimen, just a perfect footballer, and, you know, it's been years now since his demise. No skeletons have come out of the closet whatsoever. This was a guy who was just a model professional in every sense of the word, on and off the field. And as I say in the book, I mean, so many well-respected figures in the football world have said that if Duncan Edwards had lived, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he would have captained England in 1966 when he would have been 29 years old. That is the culmination of his dynasty, really. The dynasty being that Bobby Moore wouldn't have been the captain of England, that Duncan Edwards would, and that Jack Charlton maybe might not have got into the England team in '66. Sadly, of course, we'll never know. I mean, one of the chapters of his very short life, which makes his death even worse, is the fact that he didn't die in the Munich Air Disaster. He survived in hospital for some 14 or 15 days afterwards and then died of kidney failure. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's just tragic. For a lot of that time, he was in a coma, and occasionally he would come around. And when Jimmy Murphy, the Manchester United assistant coach, came to visit him in the hospital, Manchester United were meant to be playing Wolves on that coming Saturday, and it would have been a top-of-the-table clash. Wolves were top of the league at the time. And Duncan Edwards came around when he saw Jimmy Murphy, and he said, what time's kick-off on Saturday, Jim? That's the first thing he said to him, and Jimmy Murphy said, 3 o'clock, usual time, son. And Duncan Edwards said, get stuck in. That's all his mind was focused on. It wasn't on life or death or the crash. It was still on football.
Absolutely. Let's look at a few happier images rather than the ones that we have in our head of the poor boy being in a hospital bed, of course, in Munich. This picture here, I think that's is that his England debut?
I think it is, yeah. Against Scotland.
Against Scotland, yeah. I think it was at Hampden Park, wasn't it?
Wembley.
Wembley?
7-2, I think England won that game.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's on. He did play against them, I think, later at Hampden Park. But doesn't that pose show the rippling muscles, the taut frame, the concentration on the boy's face, even for those days, rather a stylish haircut?
Well, he was the perfect physical specimen. He was just over 6 foot tall. I believe he's around 13 stone.
Yeah.
All solid muscle. But in spite of the fact that he was a big man, he was also very quick.
Yeah.
I spoke to Wilf McGuinness when we were researching the book, and Wilf McGuinness said if you look at a lot of the pictures of Duncan Edwards, his thighs are so big, he has to hitch his shorts up over at the waistband to get them over his thighs. They were so big.
Absolutely amazing. Another image there, Maplesby, of course, in the middle, Duncan Edwards on his left, and another member of the Busby Babes on his right. I think that's Dennis Filer, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, OK. Right, so, look, the legend that is Duncan Edwards is illustrated in this book, written by James Leighton. It's called The Greatest. What an apt title for the book. I'm delighted to say, joining us on the phone now, David Meek, the legendary, and I mean legendary, Manchester Evening Chronicle reporter who joined his newspaper the day after the Munich Air Disaster. How about that? And he's with us now on the Skype phone. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Your memories of the Duncan Edwards saga going back over half a century, can you relate them to us? Hello, David.
Hello, sorry,
oh, David.
Hi, I'm here.
Yeah, sorry, David. We just had a bit of a problem with the fibre optic cable. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think I'm right in saying that you joined the Manchester Evening News a couple of days after the Munich Air Disaster. Therefore, one of the first stories you would have covered would have been the sad and tragic demise of this legendary figure, Duncan Edwards.
Yes, you're quite right, Mike. Yes, it was a very difficult, traumatic time. Our reporter who'd covered United for 25 years was one of the 8 journalists killed. Actually, I'd already joined the paper as a political writer, but the editor knew I had a bit of a background in sport, and he asked me if I would cross over in the emergency and take over United, which, of course, I was pleased to do.
OK. What effect over the years has the Munich Air Disaster had on the way Manchester United has been perceived as a worldwide famous club, and has it contributed to its massive growth and popularity, tragic though the incident was?
Yes, I think Munich caught the imagination of people, well, dare I say, all over the world, certainly all over the country. And that came on top of Matt Busby creating an exciting team of the Busby Babes, including Duncan Edwards, and they certainly fired the public with imagination because of the way they played their football. And so Munich definitely played the part in spreading the word about Manchester United.
It certainly did. David, can you tell me this? What was the sense of loss across the country all those years ago in '58? Because, of course, Duncan Edwards died 2 weeks, 14 or 15 days after the actual crash itself. Most people would have been relieved that this young man who was going to emerge as a future England captain maybe would survive, and then he didn't. So it was a double whammy blow. Was there a sense of terrible mourning across the country, similar to, you know, the loss of a prime minister or something like that?
Oh, I think so, without elevating football quite to government level, but in terms of how people felt, it was a national tragedy, and people, I mean, the atmosphere in Manchester at the time was one of, people were distraught. They'd taken the Busby Babes, Matt Busby's first real team. Well, not his first team, that was immediately after the war that won the Cup in '48, but the team that he created after that was in his own image. They were very skillful, they could all play, and it was exciting to watch, so that I guess people appreciated that they were a work in progress, because they were also very young. I mean, Duncan Edwards was only 21 when he died, and they were cut off in their prime, but there was a sense of expectation that they were never able to fulfil, which just added to the torment at the time.
It certainly did. James?
Just wondering, David, you obviously saw Duncan play quite a bit. I mean, where did you think was his best position? Because obviously he played all over the pitch for Manchester United and England.
Well, I think wing half, because centre half, I'm not decrying that position, because a lot of people, including Sir Alex Ferguson these days, regards it as the pivotal position in the team. But I think Duncan could play centre forward in his suit without falling over. Because he was so strong and powerful and had such great balance. It was a double for him at centre half, and his talents would have been wasted there, because he had such a great engine that if he was played at either right half or left half, he got up and down the pitch. He could help defend. He could score goals, and he was able to take a freer role. And so I think that. Wing half, as we used to call them in those days, was his best position.
Mm-hmm. And do you generally think, David, that he would have been the leader of our team in '66 for the World Cup final?
Yes, I think he would. He would have gone to the World Cup immediately after Munich. In fact, Jimmy Armfield, who did his national service in the army at the same time as Duncan Edwards, he reckons that England would have won the World Cup in '58, had or '62 as well. Had Duncan been spared, he really thought he was a unbelievably good player. Bobby Charlton was another of his fans from those days, and I think he was. Jimmy also reckoned that. Jimmy was a great captain himself, that he would acknowledge that Duncan Edwards was a bit ahead of him in the pecking order to be captain of England.
OK. A funny sort of question this, David, but is he never forgotten at Old Trafford? I mean, amazing things have happened at Manchester United Old Trafford over the last 5 or 6 decades since the sad demise of Duncan Edwards. Is he still fondly remembered every day?
I think he is among the die-hard fans. I mean, it's a long time ago now, 60 years or so. But Manchester United have always had a great sense of history, and the real supporters know about the history. It's as Alex Ferguson always says, history is important in football. If you don't know where you've been, there's no chance of you knowing where you're going, which is very to the point when you think about it. So more people know about Duncan Edwards, I think, than you would credit for somebody who died over 60 years ago.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. I mean, James Leighton, the author, is a young man, as you can see, and he's got so interested in the book, he's written himself. David, I want to thank you very much indeed for coming on and joining us on the show today. Of course, Duncan Edwards is the legend, yourself a legend in journalism. I hope you don't mind me saying that, and it's been great to have your views.
Well, that's a first, and I wish James all success with his book. He's got a great subject. And I've not read the book yet, but I'm sure he's done him justice.
Okay,
thank you, David.
That's great. David, thank you very much indeed. That was David Meek, legendary, and I'm a journalist, and you're a journalist, James, a legendary Manchester reporter for the Evening News for the whole of the 50 years since... nearly 60 years, isn't it, since the Munich Air Disaster. Right, OK, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Don't go anywhere. We've got more to tell you about the Duncan Edwards story. The book is called The Greatest. The author is James Leighton, who's in the studio with me, and we've got another 15 minutes of tribute to Duncan Edwards. Be back with you very shortly. Welcome back. You're watching Sports Tonight Live, and this is a very special programme. What we're doing is dedicating this programme to Duncan Edwards. Yes, we have in the studio James Leighton, the author of this book, OK? Duncan Edwards, the greatest. That's the way they described him when he was alive. Sadly, of course, the boy perished in the Munich Air Disaster, one of the greatest tragedies of modern times, certainly in sport and definitely in football. OK, James, thank you very much indeed for being in the studio. During the course of your research to write the book, what sort of response did you get from people who you went to find out more about Duncan Edwards?
Everyone was very keen to be involved. Everyone
Yep.
I spoke to was desperate to speak about Duncan to make sure that the story was out there. I spoke to his teammates, such as Harry Gregg and Kenny Morgans.
Harry Gregg, fantastic.
And Harry Gregg is someone who will call a spade a spade. If
Yep.
someone did anything out of place, he will tell you. And in his eyes, Duncan Edwards was not only the greatest, but was also a gentleman, an absolute
Yep.
gentleman. I also put adverts in the papers in Dudley and Manchester to see if I could get any response from people
Really?
who were friendly with Duncan.
Great initiative, yeah.
Yeah, and I had a tremendous response, particularly from a couple called Dave and Pat Sharrock, who turned out to be Duncan's best friends away from the football field.
Golly.
And actually introduced Duncan to his fiancée Molly Leach,
Yep.
which was a story which had never been told before.
Right.
So that was fascinating.
I must admit, I wasn't aware of Molly Leach until I read your book. I thought football was his total life. I didn't even know that he'd, met a young lady with whom he was planning the rest of his life.
Well, I think there were a few stories when he first met Molly Leach. He was absolutely infatuated with her. I mean, Duncan Edwards wasn't a ladies' man by any means. Wilf McGuinness says they went on a tour to Ireland,
Yeah.
and Wilf McGuinness was keen to go out dancing and chasing the girls, and Duncan Edwards just wanted to sit still with a lemonade.
Right.
But as soon as he met Molly Leach, he was besotted, and a few fans said that when he met Molly Leach, for a few weeks afterwards, his performances were below par,
Right.
because he was spotted going on the bus late at night across Manchester to meet with her.
On the bus?
On the bus.
Duncan
and
Edwards?
At lunchtime, he'd go to the factory where she worked to meet her for lunch every day, to cycle to the factory. And in the end, he had to hide around the corner like a Cold War spy in a trilby coat and jacket, because he would just be inundated with autograph requests wherever he went.
Yeah.
And then he would go back on his bike at the end of the day to cycle home with her.
Amazing. Can you imagine Wayne Rooney going across town in a bus, right? And then, or even sneaking off on a bike and hiding, around the corner from a factory? Unbelievable, isn't it?
Well, these were the times when players were earning £15 a week. I mean, Duncan Edwards used to holiday in Butlins. And in fact, that's where he met Dave and Pat Sharrock on a holiday in Butlins.
Yeah.
And in fact, during that time, Butlins would run football camps during the summer.
Right.
A lot of professional footballers would run the camps to make money in between
sure,
the summer months.
sure.
And Duncan Edwards would join in. He's 18 years old, playing for Manchester United in England.
Yeah.
And he'd join in the Butlins holiday camp and play as if it was the World Cup final.
Yeah, just because it was a game of football.
He loved it.
Unbelievable. Right, OK. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Special show here commemorating the life of Duncan Edwards, written by James Leighton, the author in the studio with me. It's called The Greatest, and that's because a lot of people think he was the greatest. My father included. He saw him play and said he was the greatest English footballer he'd ever seen. I'm delighted to say we have another guest on the show, and that is Cliff Butler, who is the statistician for Manchester United, and he's with us now. Cliff, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mike. You okay?
Yes, I'm indeed. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to have you on the show. I've got James Leighton in the studio with me. James has written this fantastic book, Duncan Edwards, The Greatest, and we're talking about the boy's life. It's absolutely fascinating. Can I ask you this, please, Cliff, as the statistician for Manchester United, where does Duncan Edwards stand in the pantheon of greats which have passed through Manchester United over the years? The Charltons, the George Bests, the Dennis Laws, and many, many more recently.
I think without question, and by general consensus, he's one of the truly great figures in Manchester United's history. It was just a huge tragedy that his life was cut short so early, because the potential was, like the man himself, enormous, I think.
Absolutely. As the statistician for the club, Cliff, are you regularly asked about Duncan Edwards? Because in those days and times, there's so little footage about him. If you're asked now about George Best, you've got plenty of footage. If you're asked now about Wayne Rooney, you've got every moment of his life. But there's so little left for us about Duncan Edwards.
It's funny you should say that, because in United's history, if there's three players that I would have liked to have seen, I actually missed seeing Duncan Edwards by a few months. My first game I can really remember going to with my father, like everybody did in those days, was against Aston Villa on Boxing Day of 1958. So that was a few months after Duncan lost his life. And the other players like Billy Meredith, who played during the Victorian age and beyond, and a lad called Joe Spence in the 1930s. Along with Duncan Edwards, they're probably the three players that I would like to have seen. If you could reel back time and say I want to see footage of those three players, they were probably the ones. I mean, Duncan Edwards is spoken about in awe. Every former player that you talk about who played with him just talks about him as though he was a god.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, sometimes people's reputation becomes bigger as they get older, and I think that's happened a little bit with Duncan. But he was such a huge figure, you know. 21 when he died, strangely on the 21st of February as well, and it was just such a huge tragedy, not just for Manchester United, but for England as well. You know, the build up to the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. I mean, they lost Tommy Taylor, they lost Roger Byrne. I think at the time there was a feeling that England may just have had a chance in that World Cup.
Oh, I have no doubt about it. A loss for the world as well, James.
Hi, Cliff. I'm just wondering, you know, how much did this affect the history of Manchester United? Obviously, we've discussed how it would affect England, but can you imagine if Duncan Edwards had lived and played alongside George Best, Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law in the team of the 60s? I mean, how well would that team have done?
Well, it's strange. I've seen this attempted a few times, trying to rewrite the future as it would have been without the Munich Air Disaster. And at the time, people were talking about United as on a par with the great Real Madrid side, who you'll know, James, won the European Cup for 5 successive years. And the feeling was that United were ready to take over from Real Madrid, and with players of that calibre, with Eddie Coleman and Duncan Edwards in the side, by the time we got to the '68 European Cup final, many people feel that United would have probably won it by 3 or 4 times by then.
Okay. Cliff, I want to thank you very much indeed. We've got a couple of more guests to come on the show. All want to pay tribute to Duncan Edwards, but it's been a real honour to have you on the show as the man in charge of the legacy of Manchester United. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Cliff Butler there, Manchester United statistician. Well, James, you know, everybody you speak to, the eulogies for Duncan Edwards just get greater and greater. Tell me finally, his legacy, of course, as a Manchester United player is always there, but what about his hometown, Dudley? They're never going to forget him, are they? Well,
in Dudley, they've already got a statue dedicated to Duncan Edwards in his England kits. I mean, Dudley...
We've got it there on the back wall.
There it is.
Yeah.
I mean... He never played for a Midlands team. He could have quite easily signed for Wolverhampton Wanderers, who were the glamour team of the 50s, and were desperate to sign him.
Won the FA Cup 3 times, I think.
They did, and they were desperate. But Duncan Edwards always wanted to play for Manchester United. But in spite of that, Duncan Edwards is revered in Dudley. There's the statue.
There's a window in the local cathedral.
In the local cathedral, which I think Matt Busby went along when they dedicated it.
Yeah. And this is a stained glass. It's a work of architecture, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think Duncan Edwards is still regarded as the greatest footballer to have ever come out of Dudley.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, more recently, they've actually named one of the town's quarters after Duncan Edwards Close, and the names of the other Manchester United players who perished in the Munich Air Disaster have had streets named after them as well.
I just think the legacy is going to last forever now, Mike. I mean, the more we hear about Duncan Edwards and the legend just grows greater by the day, but I think it's a legend that's well deserved. This isn't something that's tainted by sentiment.
No.
As I go through in my book, I've dug out match reports from when he actually played to prove that this isn't something we're all saying 50 years later. And everyone's unanimous that when he was playing at that time, he was by far the best.
The greatest. Right, just read those couple of quotes to us, please, because I think they sum up everything that people need to know about Duncan Edwards. The first one's from Jimmy Murphy, Manchester United assistant manager.
Whenever I heard Muhammad Ali on television say he was the greatest, I had to smile. There was only ever one greatest, and that was Duncan Edwards.
Incredible. And then from Sir Bobby Charlton.
He was the only player that made me feel inferior.
Incredible. Imagine Bobby Charlton saying that. Right, folks, we've really enjoyed looking into the life of Duncan Edwards. This has been a privilege and a pleasure to do this show. James Leighton is the author of this book, Duncan Edwards, the Greatest. That's just about sums it up. There's nothing more I can say. Thanks very much for having joined us on Sports Tonight Live. Stay ahead of the game with Sports Tonight Live. Don't miss a thing. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Search for Sports Tonight Live on Facebook and like our fan page. Follow Sports Tonight TV on Twitter and tweet us your thoughts and opinions. Sports Tonight Live, it's the platform for the fans.
I think, as I said in the book, Mike, I've grown up in a football family. My father is a football fanatic. and we've always, even though we're Cardiff City supporters, we've always been travelling to games to look at the stars of today. And when we go to these games, we'd always have that age-old conversation, who is the greatest footballer of all time? And my godfather would come along on the trip, and throughout the 1950s, he would travel all around the country. He was a football fanatic. He wanted to watch Stanley Matthews, Billy Wright, and he'd say, well, we were talking about Zidane, Maradona, Ronaldo. He'd say, without a shadow of a doubt, Duncan Edwards is the greatest footballer of all time. Play in every position for Manchester United, including he played in goal in the Charity Shield, where he kept a clean sheet during his stint in goal. How many players in the English game could play in every single position, right foot, left foot, at the back, up front, and be called world-class in every position?
It's what Bobby Charlton says to him in a quote in your book. He could pass short, he could pass long, he could play defensively, he could play attacking, he could head the ball. He was the greatest. That's the pictures you're talking about. That is the iconic picture. Duncan Edwards, young, handsome, strong, fit as a fiddle, virtual teetotaler, man who dedicated himself to football. The loss is just one of the greatest tragedies in the history of football, the Munich Air Disaster of 1958. I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome into the studio today James Leighton, author and writer, who has put together the definitive story of Duncan Edwards. Sadly, we lost him at 21, already an England international, 2 FA Cup final victories, and he'd been in the semi-final of the European Cup. Over the next half hour, we're going to tell you his story. Well, James, thank you very much indeed for joining me in the studio today. First of all, I have to say to you, you don't have any obvious links with Duncan Edwards. He was born in the Midlands. He played for Manchester United. You yourself are from South Wales. So what was your instigation and what was your motivation to write this book? Welcome to Sports Tonight Live. Welcome in particular to a very special programme that we want to bring you today. Some footballers are described as living legends. Some footballers, unfortunately, who are legends, are no longer with us. And one of those footballers that falls into that second category is, of course, Duncan Edwards. Duncan Edwards was said to be the greatest English footballer of all time, or could have been. My father watched Duncan Edwards play, and he told me he was the greatest he'd ever seen. Sadly, of course, Duncan Edwards is no longer with us, being a victim of one of the most terrible chapters.
And he was quite insistent on that. So as the years went by and YouTube came about, I started to look at a few flickering black and white images of Duncan Edwards playing on YouTube.
As we see here in the studio.
That's right. And I just wanted to get to the bottom of it once and for all, to try and really find out just who this man was and was he as great as so many revered people in the game say he is.
OK, and having now researched and written the book, what's your verdict?
More so than ever. I was quite sceptical at first about whether he could be called the greatest of all time, because after all, he only played 4 seasons of professional football. But when you weigh up the fact that Duncan Edwards could play, and he did